Today's date is May 15th, 2003. This is day 3 of the evidentiary hearings in phase 1 of the Songs order investigation into costs related to the extended outages at the San Onofre Nuclear Generation Station. We refer to that as Songs throughout this proceeding. We are going to proceed with Ms. George, who's going to continue her cross-examination of Mr. Perez. Ms. George?
I'm a little confused. So I thought we were starting at 10. Is the webcast on now?
The webcast is on?
Yes. All right.
Yesterday, they could not start the webcast until 10 for technical reasons. They were able, now that it's up and running, they could start it at 9:30, and you're on. Do you need to be off the record for a little bit?
I'm almost ready, but yeah, that was...
Let's go off the record for a moment.
Thank you. Just to recap.
Let me just actually remind Mr. Perez, you are under oath.
Understand. Yes.
What we were cross-examining Mr. Perez on yesterday had to do with the comparison between Unit 2 and Unit 3. We had a couple lines of questioning going. One was...
Direct your question to Mr. Perez.
Okay, well, I'm just getting everybody back on the same page to understand where we're trying to go with this testimony and with these questions. So the issues that we were discussing, we started discussing the differences and similarities between Unit 2 and Unit 3. And is this... I guess it's on. And then the question also had to do with whether Unit 3 whether it was reasonable to make other expenditures and continue, for example, to test Unit 3 when you knew you were putting it in preservation mode. In other words, there are a lot of expenses that relate to continuing to work on Unit 3 and actually also Unit 2.
Okay, Ms. George, I don't think this is a little more foundation than is necessary. You need to get to the question.
I will get to the question, but Your Honor, I actually had a question for you first. Yesterday, you mentioned that we were going to be looking at revisiting 2012 costs related to steam generator replacement project in 2013. So
I'm not sure what you're referring to. There's phase 3 of this proceeding. If you review the scoping memo and a series of subsequent rulings, you will see that incremental steam generator replacement costs will be, for purposes of rate recovery, will be considered in phase 3 along with the overall review of the steam generator replacement costs.
Right, so that's not what I was getting at. What I was getting at was all the other costs that are not directly related to the steam generator replacement project. For example, there is a...
Ms. George, this is the time to ask questions, to cross-examine Mr. Perez.
I understand that, Your Honor, but
I'm not hearing questions to Mr. Perez.
You will in a minute. This is something that I wanted to ask you first because I was...
What, are you asking me for a clarification of scope?
A clarification of scope.
Then let's be quick.
For a simple example, in 2012, they bought office furniture for the plant, and I can give you the reference on the office furniture. The text makes
perfectly clear that that's base O&M.
I understand that. So that's the question that I have is when you have expenses that are not directly related to the steam generator replacement project, will those costs also be revisited in phase 3?
Parties are in phase 3 may make what arguments they wish. We are now in phase 1, where the focus of phase 1 are the costs in 2012. We're using this time, this limited time, to explore those costs and to test Mr. Perez's and other witnesses' testimony as to the reasonableness of those 2012 expenses. If you don't have any questions in that area, I'll move on to another
I have a lot of questions in that area, but I wanted to make that, put that question out there, and I'm still not clear what the, whether or not the Phase 1 will determine final costs for 2012 on all of the issues that are not directly related to the steam generator replacement cost. That's my question for you. So we don't have to discuss it
I think that's been
further.
adequately answered, both in rulings in response in part to your motions and repeatedly throughout this hearing. So I'd like you to turn to Mr. Perez and proceed with your cross, because that's what we're here for.
All right, well, I just wanted to put it on record that I'm not clear yet. So anyway, Mr. Perez, we're going to be referencing the AIT report, which is the attachment A to the OII.
All right. Do you have that, Mr. Perez, or do you need a moment?
I need a moment to see if
All
I
right.
have it.
Let's go off the record.
In the Unit 3. That's similar, yes, Mr. Perez?
Unfortunately, I lost you in the numbers there.
You see these two charts on one page 12 and one page is on page 14. You understand what these are?
These are two tables from the AIT report issued by the NRC on July 18th.
Yes,
We're
I
looking at
understand. Yes,
pages-
that's
George, would you put, the witness needs to answer the question.
that's not my question.
Right, but you need to let him answer, because there's a court reporter, and when you...
I hear you.
You're
I will.
interrupting me too, Ms. George, and this has been a problem. I need you to stop, and when you ask a question, allow the witness to answer. And if the judge is addressing you, you need to stop and listen. And you need to ask questions, not testify. So given that, please proceed with Mr. Perez.
The final column on both of those pages, the total indications, are those similar numbers?
No, the total indications are very different for Unit 2 versus Unit 3.
I'm
Unit
talking
2
about the last,
Ms. George?
the last column.
Ms. George, he has not finished his response. If you're not able to conduct a cross-examination, I'll cut you off. Okay, so Mr. Perez, please finish your response.
The total indications identified on this table, total indications for Unit 2 are 1,984. For Unit 3, the total indications are 5,204.
The question that I asked Mr. Perez was the last column, which is the number of tubes with indications.
And what about that?
Are those numbers quite close together?
Definition of close is different for various people. One number is 734, the other one is 919.
And the second table below that?
Unit 2 total tubes is 861. Unit 3 is 887.
So there's not that much difference between them, is that correct?
For the second steam generator, E89, one steam generator has a delta of about 20 tubes.
All right. And we were also discussing fatigue yesterday. I'd like you to turn to page 20.
Of which document?
Same document.
Okay.
Pencil, please. The page 20, there's a diagram for the flowering effect, and on page 19, there is some text describing it. Before we get into the flowering effect, however, there is also a paragraph 2 on page 19. This is where Mitsubishi describes the Unit 3 as better than Unit 2. Is that your understanding, that there were some things about Unit 3 that had, that were better than Unit 2?
As indicated here on this page 19 of the AIT report, it does say that Mitsubishi identified that the Unit 3 replacement steam generators had better dimensional controls during the fabrication process.
All right. And the last sentence in that paragraph said that these better controls resulted in less variability of as-built critical dimensions. Is that your understanding?
And the sentence continues to say such as anti-vibration bar thickness, tube roundness, and gaps between tubes and anti-vibration bars. That's what the sentence indicates.
Right. And you said that the October, or I forget, the gap study for Unit 3 took place in the fall?
We conducted gap measurements on Unit 3, I believe it was in October.
Right. So this indicates that the gaps between tubes in Unit 3 would actually be better than Unit 2. Is that correct?
The gap testing that we did was between the tube and the anti-vibration bar.
That's the description here. This talks about less variability of as-built critical dimensions such as anti-vibration bar thickness, tube roundness, and gaps between tubes and anti-vibration bars.
So what's the question?
So the question is, you mentioned this, that the gap study, I'm sorry, you forget the name, you just said gap inspection for Unit 3 was conducted in order to assist your understanding of what was going on in Unit 2. Is that correct?
We conducted the measurement of that gap in both units in order to determine and identify the as-found condition of both units, and then used Unit 3 data to aid in the analysis of the Unit 2 analyses.
If the Unit 3, however, was an improved version of Unit 2, would it be applicable?
We were looking to get as-found conditions.
Edison made improvements in the manufacturing of Unit 3, is my understanding, because it was built second, so you were able to learn from the construction of Unit 2, and there were some changes made in Unit 3 fabrication. Is that correct?
Objection, relevant, Your Honor.
It's relevant to the difference between Unit 2 and Unit 3, which Mr. Perez said they were studying in October 2012.
The question was so long that I lost it as well. So can you try to narrow the question down and ask it succinctly?
Did Edison and Mitsubishi improve the design and fabrication of Unit 3?
Objection sustained. That's outside scope.
This paragraph describes is discussing the failures, and it mentions that Unit 3 was fabricated in an improved, that it was improved, and I'm just trying to establish the fact that it was, that it had been improved a couple of years before, but why was it improved is the question.
Well, first of all, I would say that that's a mischaracterization of the testimony. I don't see, failure. One particular correlation of dimensional controls was improved dimensional controls. That's one element. But the question here is what's relevant to 2012 expenses.
This is what I'm getting at.
Well, the design issues aren't being adjudicated in this phase.
I'm not doing that. I'm just asking Mr. Perez to confirm that Unit 3 had different dimensional controls because it had been improved in the fabrication process.
That's a more refined question, and that can go. that's sustained, overruled. She can ask that.
Okay, so unfortunately, I lost the question.
I think she's asking you if you agree with this statement that Unit 3, in this statement, in this paragraph that she referred to you regarding the dimensional controls, I think she's asking you if there is something different in Unit 3 than in Unit 2. Thank you.
My understanding is that fabrication of Unit 3, as indicated in this paragraph, was different from Unit 2 with respect to these tolerances.
And Unit 3 was built after Unit 2.
That's correct.
Thank you. So now let's go on to look at the flowering effect. We have a diagram on page 20, and would you describe what the flowering effect is, Mr. Perez? What's your understanding of it? Give a very short description. We have a description in the text, but I wanted to know if you are familiar with the flowering effect.
I am very vaguely familiar with this, and it's getting beyond my level of expertise.
Well, we're going to take it pretty simple. On the diagram, it shows the tube bundle bulging out. Is that correct? At the top, that's what the flowering effect is, that the tubes and, let's see, the elastic deformation of the anti-vibration bar structure and the tube bundle in the U-bend region as a result of thermal expansion and fluid dynamic pressure. And so this is something that moves the tubes out.
Okay.
Is that correct? I'm getting at the fatigue question from yesterday, Your Honor.
So her question is that your understanding of what this document says?
My understanding is that the tubes would deform as indicated in this conceptual drawing here. The portions of the tubes would expand outwards, and some of the tubes from the top would come in towards the tube support plate.
And the driving mechanism for that bending, according to the text, is fluid dynamic pressure.
That's beyond my level of expertise.
That's beyond your level of expertise. Well, we can continue later and ask Mr. Palmisano as well, but I think that this is something that we can establish because the question returns to this is not. We're talking about the fatigue. Is there metal fatigue that occurs when a piece of metal is bent over and over again?
I think you asked two questions there. Can you repeat it?
Does metal fatigue occur when a piece of metal is bent repeatedly?
Yes.
Would the flowering effect potentially cause metal fatigue?
I'm not sure of that. That's beyond my level of expertise.
All right.
Ms. George, I'm going to give you a couple more questions to try to tie this back to 2012 expenses because you're right on the edge of Phase 3 scope.
Yes, well, we're going to introduce our exhibit now. This was handed out to everyone. This is the...
So WEM1 has been marked. Would you like to identify it for the record?
This is the confidential version of the Edison root cause evaluation for Unit 2.
All right.
And
Just to clarify, Your Honor, I'm sorry to interrupt you, Ms. George, but it's actually not the confidential version, it's the redacted version.
Right.
at the top of mine, it says confidential redacted version, so...
That's because there's redactions on page 2.
Well, it
says redacted. So do you have a question for Mr. Perez about this exhibit?
Yes.
All right, Mr. Perez?
I have it.
The page 2, OSG and RSG would refer to what? At the top of the table?
OSG is original steam generators. RSG would be replacement steam generators.
All right. And then what we are seeing in this document, under secondary side, that's the third piece down there. The operating pressure, PSIA, that stands for pressure. What is this? What's PSIA stand for?
Pounds per square inch atmospheric.
All right. And the original steam generator was operating at 900.
Those are the design and operating parameters as indicated here. The operating pressure at 100% power was 900.
Can you tell us, do you know what the operating pressure on the replacement steam generators is?
I do not know that.
All right, let's take a look at the AIT document again. Page 22.
Which section?
The same section, it's just the next page that we were looking at. It's right after the flowering effect.
Okay. Are you there, Mr. Perez?
Yes.
Please proceed, Ms. Jordan.
Down at the bottom of the page, there's 5 bullet points, and you see there's the varying steam generator pressures. Is one of the things that they're looking at. So,
Is that a question?
the question is, does Mr. Perez agree with Mitsubishi that the range is between 833 and 942?
The bullet reads varying steam generator pressures from 833 to 942 PSIA, but I don't know the reference or the context for this bullet point.
Do you understand what steam generator pressures are?
Yes, I do.
And did the pressures have anything to do with the failures?
I'm going to object this whole line of questioning. I don't see the tie-in.
Yeah,
We are talking about the nature and effect of the steam generator failures, is that right?
as it relates to decision-making regarding costs incurred in 2012. We're
Yes.
not going into the causes, we're not going into the truth or questions about the conclusions of an MHI report. You're asking Mr. Perez to offer excuse me, you're asking Mr. Perez to offer an opinion on a document in which he says, I don't know what's the background of this document, what the NRC, he's not the appropriate witness to identify what NRC meant. You've asked him whether he understands and agrees. He doesn't have he's testified he doesn't know enough about it to the conclusion to know whether he agrees or not. Furthermore, as counsel said, you're into the causes of the steam generator. You're not relating it. The fact that there is outages is what is established here. The fact that there is tube wear is being established here. It is not who's responsible. It's not how it came to be that way. The question is what does that knowledge, what does Edison do with that knowledge in 2012, whether it's accurate or not in your opinion, or later in their opinion? It's what did they do with that knowledge, and was it reasonable based on that information?
That's exactly what I'm talking about.
Well, your line of questioning hasn't been there. So I need you to tie this back to 2012 expenses. Otherwise, this line of questioning, I don't see where it's taking us in Phase 1.
I'm sorry, the trajectory of my questions is exactly as you stated it, Your
Well,
Honor.
then you need to get to the
I
point.
I can't make everything in one question. It would be a compound question, so I have to divide them up into several questions. Each single question, I intend to go to that end that you described.
Well, you need to get there because...
I am working on it.
All right.
Thank you.
And you need to make sure that when you're not here to make statements of opinion either. You're here to get to a question.
The question that I have has to do with the determination that Edison made in 2012 to put Unit 3 in preservation mode, but not to put Unit 2 in preservation mode. And this is where excuse me, let me try to breath. The question of how badly damaged the reactors, steam generators were, Mr. Perez, did that enter into Edison's calculations of whether Unit 3 should be put into preservation mode?
Can you repeat the question, please?
The calculation of how badly damaged the steam generators were, was that the issue that determined whether Unit 3 was put in preservation mode?
The extent of damaged tubes on Unit 3 versus Unit 2 was one of the items that was considered with respect to putting the unit in a preservation mode, or as in the case of Unit 2, to continue the path to restart the unit.
So the condition of the tubes was central to your decision-making?
It was one of the many factors that were considered.
Right, I understand there was other damage. Yes? Are those the other factors? What are the other factors? Did they have to do with damage to the steam generators or something else?
You're correct. There was various types of indications on the tubes. We also needed to consider the amount of resources we had available to analyze the situation and develop a restart plan, and then put that forth to the NRC.
Thank you. I will reserve the rest of these questions for Mr. Palmisano on the issue of how the pressure measurements relate to those questions. And I did have another series of questions, but I don't believe you're the right person. I just wanted to ask you, however, were you involved in the community outreach, or are those and emergency preparedness events, for example, or are those questions that I should ask Mr. Warden instead?
I have not been involved in those activities.
But you did sponsor a piece of testimony that has a chart of the community outreach events. That's part of your testimony, is that right?
No, it's not right.
It's in the very beginning of the...
It's 4, and it's Mr. Warden's testimony. I believe.
it's... I need to
All right, let's go off the record. Third, we're going to take a 5-minute break. If there's no other cross at this point, the judges will have some questions for Mr. Perez. All right, we're going to just take a 5-minute break.
So you're on.
Mr. Perez, I'm going to start with a few questions that I want to just make sure that I understand your testimony, so I'm going to ask you about different things that are in here and ask you what you meant by them.
Okay.
Okay? And I may ask you some more detail about them as implied by the direct testimony.
Okay.
All right. So let's start. I'm mostly going to be walking you through SCE 04.
Okay.
All right. So I'd like you to turn to page 13. And I'm going to ask, and please speak into the microphone. I'm going to try to do that too. Some of the audience members are having a little trouble hearing us. Hopefully the webcast is picking us up. All right, at the bottom of page 13 and going into 14 is a sentence, as detailed in the restart plan submitted in October 12, SCE plans to restart Unit 2 at 70% power with a mid-cycle outage following 150 cumulative days of operation to allow for additional steam generator inspection, right?
Correct.
So it's setting up the discussion of the restart plan. On this next page, the restart plan is pending NRC approval. SCE also continues to evaluate the steps that would be necessary to allow the safe restart of Unit 3. Do you see that?
Yes, I do.
So this is saying as of October 12, you're continuing to evaluate steps. Can you tell me, are those steps in any kind of written document?
Not to my understanding. It's to the effect that as we learn information about what it would take to restart Unit 2, we then have that knowledge and would be able to apply it to Unit 3.
So by October 2012, did you have an understanding of what kinds of steps might be part of that plan or that evaluation?
We had some of the information, but not all of it, because the interaction with the NRC had not been completed.
Right. What information did you have?
We had the inspection results from the eddy current testing, as well as the gap measurements on the secondary side.
So are those the two primary documents that are driving Edison's evaluation of what steps would be necessary to allow a restart of Unit 3?
There's also the operational assessments.
And those are your internal assessments?
That's correct.
And when were they taken during 2012? When were they conducted? Do you need a moment?
Yes, please.
All right.
Are we out for record?
We're on the record. Unless Mr. Perez tells me he needs more than just a moment.
I don't have the specific...
All right. Yeah, we're on the record. Yes. Sorry.
I don't have the specific dates of the operational assessments when they started nor when they were finished.
Do you know how many were conducted in 2012?
I don't have the exact number. I believe it was at least 3 of them.
Okay.
Your Honor, may I, just for purposes of a clear record, I just want to make sure that it's clear that this particular testimony that you were questioning about is not sponsored by Mr.
14?
Perez. This particular portion is not sponsored. I have no problem you're asking these questions. I just wanted to make
that
sure
was
that
the
record
only
was
one.
clear.
Okay. Okay. So now...
And what part of the testimony are we?
I'm sorry. I'm going to go off. Let's go off the record. That's fine. Now we're going to move into the functional groups, which is clearly within your testimony, right?
That's correct.
Okay, so let's talk about the operations functional group on page 18. So on line 23, it talks about the moving used fuel to dry cast storage. I want to just make sure, are we talking about, is this part of the refueling project for Unit 2, or is this part of the moving into preservation mode for Unit 3 that you're talking about here?
That portion of the sentence that talks about moving the used fuel to dry storage is neither one of those. This is the task where we move fuel from the pools into the dry storage.
Right.
That's not tied to the refueling outages nor to the defueling. We move fuel out of the pools on a regular basis to allow sufficient room in the pools for when we do have to offload the cores.
Right. Okay. I understood it differently. I thought there was testimony that there had been removal as part of the RFO because you're bringing in new fuel, right? So you have to make room. There's a rotational schedule in which fuel comes out of the pool, new fuel comes in, right?
The two aren't totally linked like that.
All right.
We move a certain number of assemblies out of each pool on a routine basis to allow for the unloading of the used fuel into the pools. And we do that every year to keep that core offload capability in the pools.
So there were no additional tasks of moving fuel to dry cast storage in 2012 other than what you expected to do under routine operations?
That's correct.
Okay. Okay, on page 17, looking at the operations functional group, and this is one where the costs, your testimony is that the base O&M was over about $5 million more in recorded than was expected or in the GRC. Can you explain to me how operational staffing would differ or how operational functions would differ between normal operations, as you've described them, and shutdown conditions, and link that to why it's more than $5 million over?
The operations activity are not very different. A lot of the plant systems are still in operation. We must maintain the fuel in the pools or in the reactor cooled, and therefore operations staff continues to operate those systems.
Okay, I want to direct your focus of your response to which parts are different, not which ones are the same.
Okay, so the ones that are different are, for example, in Unit 3, the fuel is out of the reactor, and therefore the primary focus is on the used fuel pool cooling. The shutdown cooling system in Unit 3, therefore, does not have to be operated. It's been put into lab condition. Different steps must be taken to do that. Another example would be the turbine generators. Both of them are obviously not operating. However, there are certain tasks that we must perform on those to make sure that we protect the asset. An example there would be we rotate the turbine on a routine basis so that it doesn't develop a bow.
So can you explain to me how necessary staffing levels would be different under what's required in the preservation or shutdown mode versus normal operations in this functional group?
They are not different. They would be the same.
So 100% of the people who are staffing normal operations, the ones that are operating systems that are no longer operating in shutdown, what are they doing?
They are putting the plant into a preservation mode and putting the chemicals or the air into the systems that are being vacated of fluids. And like I said, some of those other, like the turbine generator, for example, they must perform the operation of turning the turbine on a regular basis.
So your testimony is that the net man hours or gross man hours are identical between operating and a shutdown mode in 2012.
In 2012, the number of man hours may be different. I did not look at that because overtime may not be required as much to perform some of the activities. The staffing levels, though, would be the same.
So, at what point do you distinguish between staffing levels to move through normal operations into a preservation or shutdown mode, and at what point do those costs, whether it's personnel or O&M, become incremental steam generator replacement costs?
The cost became incremental when the base number of hours or dollars had been completely utilized for the base personnel.
So Edison first booked everything to base O&M until they felt they'd reached the limit, and then started booking it as incremental.
Correct.
Was there any other criteria?
If it's a contractor cost, that is cost completely incurred for inspection or repair of the tubes, that was immediately charged to the incremental cost, and not to base.
Okay. Did repair functions take place on Unit 2 and 3 throughout the year?
Yes.
And so if the expenditure cap was the determinative factor as to which bucket the cost would be booked to, is there a point in time we can point to at which all steam generator costs related to the repair or assessment of the steam generators is all going to be in incremental steam generator replacement? In other words, if you're moving to a cap and then it becomes incremental, is there a date certain that that happened?
No, we do that on a monthly basis.
On a monthly basis?
Correct.
Okay. And so I'm not sure, maybe I need to rephrase this question. To the extent that base O&M exceeded expectations by $5 million, do you have a sense of why those expenditures exceeded expectations by $5.4 million?
Yes, I do.
Could you explain that, please?
We had three primary items that resulted in that overrun. The first was a succession plan was implemented to ensure that we had sufficient senior reactor and reactor operators because of a potential retirement bubble. That added about 20 to 25 full-time equivalents. We also increased the staffing in the procedures group to bring the quality and the work backlog in that area in alignment with industry standards. And lastly, we provided the senior reactor operators a retention incentive because of the condition of the plant.
Okay. On page 20, line 13, 12 and 13, your testimony refers to some systems which were in continuous operation during 2012. It says there are a number of other plant systems that were not necessarily in continuous operation, but were required by either the SONG's operating license and technical specifications or to remain operable and capable of performing their design function as an emergency or safety backup. Can you identify for me now what those systems were that were not in continuous operation but are required by your license and technical specifications?
Sure. One example of that would be the high-pressure safety injection system that is not in operation but needs to remain ready in case it is needed to be called upon. This system provides water in an emergency to the reactor coolant system.
Okay, and I also see you cited the emergency diesel generators. Are those the only two systems that are included in your reference on line 13?
No, there would be others, but I don't have an exhaustive, complete list with me.
Okay. Do you have an idea of which ones are the most expensive to operate?
No, not right now. I don't have that. I haven't performed that study.
Do you know how these systems, all right, let me back up. When you use the term technical specifications in line 14, what are you referring to?
It is a set of design parameters that tie into the license, the NRC license, that identify parameters for the systems and requirements for the systems.
So these are out of the NRC regulations in the Title 50?
They are Edison-prepared technical specifications that are consistent with those sets of NRC criteria.
Okay, thank you. Farther down on that page, you also talk about systems maintained to protect valuable assets on behalf of customers. So my question is, if assets are, how do you determine which systems are essential to protect value for the customer?
All of the systems at the plant would be valuable to the ratepayers. And we are performing operations and maintenance activities on those systems to ensure that they don't degrade when the restart process is started.
Is there a range of industry standard as to what systems need to be maintained at maximum or minimum levels?
Our maintenance procedures and the technical specifications would provide that guidance. We have to interpret those as how to apply them to systems that are no longer in operation or put into a layup mode.
Are there systems that are being referred to here which, if they had been not maintained during 2012, can you describe to me what kind of adverse effect you think would have happened as to Unit 3?
Yes, I'll give you an example of a valve. We have to make sure that we exercise that valve so that the seals and other operating mechanisms, such as the actuators, don't degrade over that period of time. So by exercising those components, the lubricants or the seals would continue to be fresh. If we didn't perform that activity, then we'd have to do a replacement of that component, maybe even the replacement of the entire valve, in my example.
So the system and equipment that you would be focused on in these kind of activities would be ones that move. Is that right? Valves, switches.
Correct, yes.
All right, thank you.
Let me add to that, it's also systems, structures. For example, we would need to ensure that we continue to provide corrosion protection.
Okay, thank you. On page 21, the last sentence, it's a bullet point on the turbine plant cooling water system. On line 8, it says that this cooling water system cools components that are not safety related with ocean water. Can you identify what components those are? Do you need a moment off the record?
Yes, please.
All right, off the record.
with me the drawings for that system, so I could not give you a list of those components at this time.
Can you prepare a list for me of those components?
Yes, I can.
Thank you. And I'd also like to know how you determined that they are not safety related.
Safety related would be with respect to how the NRC classifies those systems.
That's the NRC rule. Okay.
Yes.
All right. This on page 24, line 20 talks about the nuclear construction group. In 2012, were the costs from this group exclusively categorized as incremental steam generator costs?
No, the activities that we discuss here are part of the base cost.
They were all base costs, or were they subject to that month-to-month split that you were talking about?
They would be subject to that month-to-month. The discussion here is relative to the base activities they would normally perform.
Okay. Further down on that page starts a section about the rotating equipment fix-it-now group. Can you tell me how the workload was different in 2012 than in 2011?
The workload doesn't change that much. The preventive maintenance and corrective maintenance would still need to be performed. Again, systems are still operating, and so things will still need to be replaced. Preventive maintenance still needs to be performed.
Well, let me ask you this. I'm thinking of the turbines, and you said that you bring people in to do some hand rotation just to keep them loose, right? So under normal operating conditions, those are turning all the time. My suspicion, which you might confirm or not, is that that would require more maintenance than if it's only being rotated on perhaps a bi-monthly basis under a shutdown condition, which would then suggest that the overall fix-it cost would be less. Is that a fair assumption?
When it's in normal operating mode, you're correct. The lubricating oil system in that example would be on and would need to have preventive maintenance performed or corrective maintenance. The pumps, in order to be able to be in a ready state, would still need to be addressed. Surveillances would need to be performed on that specific system to make sure that it is still in a restart mode. Drips, oil leaks, seals would potentially degrade, and so some of these fix-it-now costs would still be required. Overall, would they be less in this shutdown condition? I don't have that specific analysis, but as you said, we could assume that it would be lower.
But you're not able to put a percentage on it or a number on how much less routine maintenance would be in 2012 than in a routine fix-it, excuse me, in 2012 than in prior years.
Correct. I don't have that percentage.
Okay. Okay, I'd like to turn to page 28. Let me go off the record for just a moment. All right, on page 28, line 10, this is talking about a team that reviewed songs maintenance schedules on a weekly basis and identified activities that could be removed or rescheduled given that songs was in a shutdown condition. Do you see that?
Yes, I do.
Okay, who was on that team? And my question is going to, is this entirely internal or was there external consultants involved? And what kind of executive oversight and involvement was there? Go off the record.
The teams consisted of Edison employees from the primarily maintenance organization, along with some of the engineering individuals. And I don't know exactly what type of oversight from management they had, but as is typical at a nuclear power plant, they would report out to the senior manager to ensure alignment on the issues with the current plant conditions.
And who would that be?
Ultimately, it would be the station manager.
Okay. Now, do you know what criteria was used to identify which activities could be removed or rescheduled? This is relative to Unit 3.
Yes. So relative to Unit 3 layup and preservation, they wanted to ensure that the plant did not degrade. They wanted to make sure that it was consistent with industry experience with plants that had longer duration shutdowns.
And who brought that expertise to the team as to what was the industry experience?
Part of a nuclear power plant culture is that they share operating experience with each other, and so there would be information provided by the Institute for Nuclear Plant Operators, INPO, as well as potentially NEI, Nuclear Energy Institute.
Okay. So further down on the page at line 22, it's talking about this team evaluated preventive maintenance activities and surveillance tests. Is that the same team?
There were two teams that looked through the activities, one for Unit 2 and one for the layup of Unit 3.
I thought the first one was, okay, all right. So that's Unit 2, all right. So, to the extent that this team evaluated these preventive maintenance and surveillance tests and determined that some of the preventive maintenance activities could be suspended, some of the surveillance tests could be rescheduled, what was the criteria that was used to make those cuts?
It's what I just discussed, that we wanted to make sure that the equipment didn't degrade in the industry experience.
So the criteria was the same for Unit 2 and Unit 3 as to what kinds of activities would go forward?
I'm sorry, I misunderstood your other question then. For Unit 2, that team went through and ensured that whatever activities we performed would not add to the risk or degrade their preventive maintenance performance.
So would you say more maintenance was activities, preventive maintenance, and more surveillance tests were kept for Unit 2 than Unit 3?
That's correct.
Okay. On line 29 of that page, it says a comprehensive preservation plan was developed and implemented in order to minimize corrosion and other equipment degradation mechanisms. Is that preservation plan in the record?
I don't believe it is.
This plan consists of, it says on line 31, this plan consists of approximately 50 actions required to lay up and preserve systems. Would those 50 actions be included in the preservation plan?
Yes.
Do you have a copy of that preservation plan
Yes, I do.
with you?
Yes.
All right, let's make that an exhibit this afternoon. All right, thank you. Let's go off the record a moment. Line 26.
Okay.
It says the majority of O&M expense in engineering in 2012 was labor expense. So can you break, it says part of that was for maintaining the qualified technical staff. Can you break down for me how much of that was for maintaining staff and how much was related to inspection and testing of either unit?
I don't have that information with me. I'd need to look at the recorded cost information to see if we could split it up that way.
Okay.
I'm not sure if it's feasible.
So ordinarily, my understanding is that Edison breaks up labor in its accounting between employees and contract labor,
Correct.
right? So
Yes.
that would be some indication, would it not, as to the breakdown between what was the qualified technical staff versus inspection and testing, or was the inspection and testing handled only by SE staff?
Misunderstood your question. I thought you wanted a breakdown between the staff, let's say, performing or being trained versus their inspection activities.
Well, I guess my understanding was that there was an awful lot of money spent for contractors to do some inspection and testing and cause analyses and developing of repair plans and so forth.
Correct.
So I'm trying to figure out, in this particular category of expenses in engineering, where that's the big chunk in incremental and it's a big chunk here in base O&M, I'm trying to figure out what's the breakdown of what was being done.
We do have a breakdown between the Edison and the contractors, and that's in the testimony.
And where is that in the testimony? Off the record.